Okay, welcome to the last talk of our summer archaeology series. For this program, we're going to be talking about the sunken vessels of Lake George, but even bigger than that, we're going to discuss the importance of underwater archaeology. To start us off, what is underwater archaeology? If you know a little about archaeology, you know that it's mainly digging through soil. So how do we do that underwater? And more importantly, why? So before we talk about either of those, I want to talk about the different ways underwater archaeological sites are formed. There are a number of ways in which important sites and artifacts from the past end up underwater. Perhaps they're tossed over the side of a ship in dramatic fashion. Or more realistically, they're sunken purposefully, lost at sea, ceremoniously placed into the water, or end up underwater by chance due to changing coastlines, natural disasters, or erosion. We do underwater archaeology because there are a number of important archaeological sites that exist beneath the surface. And what we mainly hear about are shipwrecks. Those are the most popular type of underwater archaeology and by far the most abundant. But in many places around the world, we have evidence of camps, villages, or general habitation sites that are also found underwater. These would have been created tens of thousands of years ago along these beautiful coastlines. But as we know, and we continue to see today, coastlines change over time. What used to be land is now underwater in some places because of the rise in sea level from melting ice. This rise in sea level begins to cover these ancient sites not only in Europe and the Middle East, where sites are much older, but also here in North America. We're not going to dive too deep into this subject because it's way too big to cover in this talk, but approximately 15,000 years ago, we see people arriving and settling in North America. At this time, the climate was warming much like it is now. These massive glaciers that covered North America were melting and retreating. These glaciers were more than a mile high, so as they melt, they're creating flowing rivers, glacial lakes, and contributing to the overall rise in sea level. So coastal places where people had once settled or camped are now being covered by water. So beyond just shipwrecks, this is one of the ways that we end up with underwater archaeological sites. And these are all over the world. This photo here is a modern day example of glacial retreat. This was happening thousands of years ago when the Earth was experiencing a warming period, but it happened over a much longer period of time. Here, the first photo is in 1924, and the most recent is in 2011. That's less than 100 years, whereas in the past, this warming period would have occurred over thousands of years. As you can see, it's called glacial retreat because the melting makes the glacier appear to be moving up towards the North Pole. In terms of shipwrecks, these also end up beneath the surface various ways. Ships can be purposefully sunk using heavy material to weigh them down. They can be impacted by storm weather or natural disasters, or they can be abandoned from damage. Boats can catch fire, experience engine failure, crash, get stuck, or even hit an iceberg. All of these are ways in which shipwreck sites are formed, and shipwrecks make up the biggest portion of underwater archaeological sites by far. So now that we've talked a little bit about how sites end up underwater, I want to discuss how underwater archaeology is accomplished. Like any scientific excavation, these projects have to be approached carefully and systematically because it's our job as archaeologists to protect and preserve the artifacts being removed. At each archaeological site we come across, whether on land or underwater, the information and artifacts we gather are a finite resource that tells us about a specific point in time. If it's not done properly, we lose pieces of the story. So much like terrestrial archaeology, in underwater archaeology, they conduct survey in order to assess the site, how extensive it is, where there are higher densities of artifacts or evidence of structures. But they do all of this in short increments of time with scuba gear and oxygen tanks, as well as a slew of high-tech underwater equipment. They also use tools like sonar to detect anomalies underwater. This is a form of survey that can tell us if something unusual beneath the surface requires further investigation. Then if something is found and determined significant, Everything is systematically mapped, recorded, and photographed. And if deemed appropriate, things are bagged and brought to the surface. Now, I say deemed appropriate because the environment underwater is obviously different than the environment on land. Underwater, there's this lack of oxygen. This leads to the preservation of objects that may not preserve on land. For example, objects like wooden boats from the French and Indian War. So some things can safely be removed and brought to the surface, but a lot of the time, underwater archaeology is more about documentation and research than it is about recovery. So the photo I used here shows you a method that underwater archaeologists have adapted from terrestrial archaeology. We use string in order to lay out a unit where we will be digging. Here, they can build a grid either underwater or sometimes on the surface, and then transport it down and lay it across a certain section of the site. This is so we can more easily record information and how it's related to each other spatially. We're going to use the Titanic as an example. If you've ever been to one of the Titanic traveling exhibits, what you'll immediately notice is that the objects that travel with the exhibition are plates, serving utensils, cosmetic bottles or jars, jewelry, or pieces of metal. They supplement the exhibit with photographs and replications of the vessel interior. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is because in underwater archaeology, it does not make sense to recover everything from the site. It's much more about what makes sense to bring to the surface, what can survive that dramatic environmental change, and what can we continue to learn from without causing damage to the site. In terrestrial archaeology, almost everything that is believed to be created by people is saved unless it's a structure. That's not the case here. So before we move on to discuss the vessels in Lake George, I want to discuss why we do this work. Because in addition to what I've told you so far, underwater archaeology is full of expensive equipment. It's incredibly time sensitive. It requires professionals who can not only dive, but systematically record and recover artifacts. So with all of these special requirements and challenges, why do we do it? In its simplest explanation, we do it to learn. We do it to learn about the moment in time that this ship sank and what caused it. In North America, underwater archaeology has the potential to contribute to our knowledge of how indigenous people traveled to this country tens of thousands of years ago, or how and if they crossed the Bering Land Bridge into modern day Alaska, and how they traversed down the western coast by walking or traveling by watercraft. These are big questions about the past that underwater archaeology has the potential to help answer. So this picture here that I'm showing represents the Bering Land Bridge theory. I'm just going to quickly tell you what it is because I think it's important. And so it remains a theory because the sites that may give us confirmation are now underwater and they're not easily accessible or findable. This theory is really cool though, because it talks about how nomadic hunters and gatherers would have followed mammoth herds for food security. And they followed groups across this strip that would have been above sea level at the time that's now completely submerged. To learn about the ways people arrived on this continent, we need underwater archaeology. So while it's challenging, this is one of the reasons we do it. Okay, so now we're going to jump into the example that everyone's looking forward to, the vessels that remain at the bottom of Lake George. So in this part of the talk, we're going to move through more than 200 years of history. So to keep track of everything, I'm going to keep this timeline on the bottom of the slides where it matters. And as you can see, this is going to take us from 1755 all the way up to 1998. So let's jump in. So first, I want to start with a bit of background. Lake George is part of this huge system of water that was integral to controlling the Northern Territory. The linkage of the St. Lawrence River, Lake Champlain, Lake George, and the Hudson River are critical to the movement of weapons, supplies, and soldiers. In 1755, Lake George was given its name by a man named William Johnson in honor of King George II of England. At this point, the French and Indian War is underway, and we're seeing multiple battles for control of the continent. These waterways connected French Canada to the colonies, and if you controlled the water, you controlled the land. That's what made Lake George such a hotbed of action during this war. In 1755, the Battle of Lake George ended with a British victory and the construction of Fort William Henry. The fort was built to safeguard the British land claims, but like most things, it wasn't that simple. The French and their Native American allies didn't really like the idea of the British having a presence this far north. So in March of 1757, the French move in from the Champlain Valley and cross Lake George while it was still iced over, and they set fire to parts of the fort and several vessels. Now, this didn't completely destroy the fort, but it did cause some considerable damage to their vessels. A few months after this raid, the French and Native Americans took the fort after a multi-day battle, which ultimately became the inspiration for James Fenimore Cooper's novel, Last of the Mohicans. After this, the British attempted to take two forts that were more northern and under French control, but they failed to claim those as well. So after this losing streak, the British decide that the next step is to construct a fleet of vessels to use to defeat the French. They begin to construct a fleet of new vessels so they can traverse the waterways and plot their next move. These ships weren't actually built in Lake George. They were constructed further south in Schenectady and Albany, and then transported up here on wagons for use. Now, most of the vessels they constructed were called bateaux, but one of the boats that they built for their new plan was called a Radeau Warship. This unique vessel was wooden and had 7 sides to it. It was 52 feet long and 18 feet wide. And the reason that we know so much about it and the British fleet in general is because in 1990, after more than 200 years underwater, this vessel was found by a team of researchers at the bottom of Lake George. Before we get into the excitement of the Radeau discovery, I want to talk about the research that led up to this and why divers were in the lake in the first place. So in 1960, recreational divers found several bateaux beneath the surface of Lake George. Bateaux are the workhorse vessels. They carry men and supplies, and their goal is to get everyone and everything from point A to point B. There were hundreds of these vessels built to carry soldiers. So after several of these boats are discovered, the Adirondack Museum sees this as a valuable find and starts a campaign to locate and document the bateaux in Lake George. And they do this from 1963 to 1964. A gentleman named Terry Crandall is hired by the Adirondack Museum to lead this diving mission. And in these 2 years, he's able to locate and map more than 30 bateaux. The methods and mapping that Terry Crandall and his team were able to implement continue to be used as the baseline data that underwater archaeologists investigating Lake George use today. What's even more impressive is that scuba was still relatively new in the 1960s, and it really didn't become more mainstream until the 1970s. So the work that this team was doing in 1963 and 1964 is groundbreaking for the field in archaeology. In 1987, a group called the Lake George Bateau Research Team was formed under the lead of Joe Zarzinski. The team started to use a piece of equipment called side-scan sonar. This was so they could see intact and undisturbed bateaux deep in the water. This sonar produces an image of the seafloor that, for all intents and purposes, is like a photograph. The sonar could be towed behind the boat and could cover a large surface area in a relatively short period of time. On June 26, 1990, after a 3-day stretch of using this equipment with no luck, the team sees a vessel on one of their scans while they were on their way back to shore. Now, for those of you who aren't archaeologists, this is how it always goes. Your last day, your last effort, that's when you make your biggest discovery. So in order to confirm whatever this anomaly was underwater, a team would need to dive down and do what we call ground truthing, which means they need to go directly observe what was appearing on the sonar. We do ground truthing in terrestrial archaeology as well. It's simply a survey method meant to confirm the presence of a site. So after diving down 107 feet, they knew that what they had found was definitely not a bateau. Instead, they had found an 18th century Radeau warship. Following the discovery, they decided to launch an archaeological investigation so that the site and the ship could be preserved. They renamed the research group to Bateau Below and continued quietly working on this project. And they did it quietly because they knew the impact that this discovery would have. This is a vessel that was more than 200 years old. And if people found out, then recreational divers could come and they could loot the site. Archaeologists never want to see this happen, so they keep things as quiet as possible while work is still ongoing. In order to get a permit from the state to turn this into a real archaeological project, the Bateau Below team needed an archaeologist on their side. And it's tricky because at this point, divers were really seen as vandals and thieves and not diving for the sake of research, but instead diving to steal artifacts. Luckily, the Bateau Below team was able to prove how seriously they were taking this. And in 1991, they teamed up with an archaeologist, Dr. Kathy Abbas. They were able to conduct this research from 1991 to 1993, and the project was a huge success. The combination of volunteer divers and professional archaeologists was used as a model for a number of companies who needed to conduct underwater archaeology in the future. So this excavation was actually pretty tricky because of the depth of the Radeau. Dive times were short and divers could only work for about 12 to 15 minutes at a time for safety reasons. On top of that, the silt at the bottom was really easily disturbed. So divers had to be incredibly cautious moving up and down. To help get some of the work done, the team used an ROV to take video footage of the Radeau. This footage was amazing because anyone who was on the team that wasn't a diver got to see what the ship looked like at the bottom. And now we'll get to look at the vessel as well. So the archaeological team went on to measure every single part of this vessel to document its condition at the time of discovery. This gave them enough information to reconstruct the vessel outside of the water. For archaeology in general, the element of mapping is absolutely critical. When we're at a site, each measurement, each recorded artifact, and each feature has to be mapped so that when we're no longer at the site, we can still get an idea of what it might have looked like. This allows for more research to be done once we're out of the field. One member of the Bateau Below research team was a ship modeler named John Farrell. I had the pleasure of working with John at the Weehawken Holiday House on our excavations in 2013. And John created various scale models of the Radeau and used them to show the various parts that made this ship ready for battle. If you want to see this Radeau model, it's at the Fort William Henry Museum. So let's talk about the Radeau itself. This vessel in particular was known as the land tortoise, and we know that because British military called it that in their journals at the time of its construction. So this land tortoise has a flat bottom and walls that come up and over to protect the soldiers rowing the ship and manning the cannons from enemy musket fire. The land tortoise could support 7 cannons at a time, and this design was known as an ingenious war machine. It took 26 men to row this vessel across the water. And what you might be asking is, what was this ingenious war machine doing at the bottom of Lake George? And the answer isn't as exciting as an epic battle that caused the ship to sink, but it's actually much simpler. The British sank it themselves. Which sounds kind of crazy, right? Why would the British Army build a ship and sink it? Well, they didn't just sink the Radeau, they sank all of their ships in 1758. This included 260 bateaux and 2 Radeau warships. This Radeau in Lake George is the only remaining vessel of its class in the world, and that is because it has been fully submerged in water. When things made of organic materials such as wood are completely submerged in water, they're more likely to preserve because the elements that contribute to material degrading, like oxygen, are at much lower levels. But the British didn't sink the ship because they knew it would preserve for 200 years and then archaeologists would find it. They sank the Radeau and other vessels to protect them. See, in the winter, the ice can become unpredictable, causing damage to boats and preventing their use in open water. In addition, without Fort William Henry, they didn't have a post to keep an eye on their fleet and protect it from the French and Allied Native Americans. Soldiers found locations that were somewhat shallow and filled their bateau and the land tortoise with tons and tons of rocks in order to sink them to the bottom. In the spring, when the ice is cleared, soldiers could swim out and remove the rocks from the vessels and float them back to the surface. Now, this was not a new concept. Native Americans had been doing this for centuries before. Dugout canoes are literally the entire trunk of a tree hollowed out and used as a boat. These were too heavy to take in and out of the water, especially once the wood had absorbed the water. So they had to be sunk and then brought back up in the spring. Now, the reason we know this is because hundreds of dugout canoes have been found in the United States in various wetland areas. Styles and designs for these dugout canoes varied in different locations. Dugouts found in the Florida Everglades, for example, are mostly flat and would have been used more like a paddleboard than a seated canoe. If they absolutely had to carry a boat with them, here in the Northeast, it would have been much simpler to carry a birch bark canoe. But like any boat, these came with their own set of issues. The photo on the left is actually a dugout canoe that I helped to build when I was in undergrad. And the photo on the right is a dugout from Daggett Pond in Warrensburg. And you can find it, I believe, still at Rogers Island. Okay, so back to the Radeau. In 1994, the Bateau Below team released a photomosaic image of the sunken land tortoise, and it was reconstructed using 200 individual photographs. This was the first ever seamless photomosaic of a shipwreck, and it was done using a brand new revolutionary computer program, Photoshop. After placing boundaries around the ship and adding underwater signage and information for divers, in August of 1994, the Radeau site opened to recreational divers as a submerged heritage preserve that was monitored and maintained by the Department of Environmental Conservation. Divers can also visit other vessels below the surface, such as clusters of some of the remaining bateaux. So the sunken fleet aren't the only vessels that remain at the bottom of Lake George. In 1997, Bateau Below found a 48-foot-long wooden steam launch called the Cadet. This large passenger boat was from 1893 and would have been used for excursions around the lake, but also to carry supplies to hotels along the shoreline. Originally, the Cadet was named Olive, but in 1898, it was sold to John Bolton Simpson, one of the founders of the Sagamore Hotel. Simpson was unsatisfied with the vessel and actually sold it in 1901 to Fred R. Smith. As vessels with newer technology, such as gasoline engines, emerged, the Cadet was taken out to the water and scuttled or deliberately sunk. In 2002, the Cadet was listed on the National Register of Historic Places. In 2003, Bateau Below was performing a side scan sonar in search of a fabled barge at the bottom of the lake. What they ended up finding was a wooden barge, a wooden sailboat, 3 wooden runabouts, 1 abandoned fuel tank, 1 rowboat, and 14 log clusters. So they found a big mess, basically. This barge wreck would have taken place in the late 19th or early 20th century. And while it wasn't this fabled 60-foot vessel that people always thought it was still 34 feet long, and it was integral to moving supplies around the lake. And the lake at this time was emerging as a growing vacation destination. So this barge would have been essential to moving those things around. As we've seen with these last 2 vessels, boats were critical to the growing tourism in the region. They transported people to more remote locations, brought them supplies, transported them to town for dining or supplies. This was a growing vacation destination before the invention of the automobile, so boats would have been essential to making this region accessible. Another boat that lies at the bottom of Lake George is the Minnie-Ha-Ha. Now, I'm sure you're thinking that I must be wrong because the Minnie-Ha-Ha is still in operation, but the one that I'm talking about is the original Minnie-Ha-Ha. On May 12, 1857, the 140-foot long paddle wheel steamer was launched. It carried up to 400 passengers and was retired after only 2 decades in operation. It was then towed to Black Mountain Point, where it was converted into a hotel and restaurant. In April of 1889, the Horicon Pavilion, a hotel at Black Mountain Point, was destroyed by a fire and the Minnie-Ha-Ha was closed. Over time, storms and ice damaged the vessel as it sat abandoned until the decay was just too great and the vessel was actually sunk using dynamite to break it up. The Minnie-Ha-Ha represents something important in archaeology in general, and that's the investigation aspect. Because the end of this vessel's life was poorly documented and it was severely damaged by the dynamite when it sank, it's hard for divers to know if this was in fact the original Minnie-Ha-Ha. They pieced together various clues to determine if it really was what they thought it was, such as noting the remnants of white paint that covered the exterior of the vessel and the location of the vessel, the color of the exterior, the size, the shape, and the historic documentation. All of those pieced together told them that this was the original Minnie-Ha-Ha. There are numerous other vessels that were sunk in the 20th century for various reasons, but I won't cover all of those here. If you want to read more about this subject, Joe Zarzinski and Bob Benway wrote a book called Lake George Shipwrecks and Sunken History, which I cannot recommend enough. It's a comprehensive and interesting look at the many vessels at the bottom of Lake George. But the last vessel that I want to talk about is called the Baby Whale Submarine. This 15-foot submarine was sunk on the evening of August 4th, 1960, by what is believed to be a group of pranksters. The sub wasn't found until June 18th, 1995, when Joe Zarzinski and Bob Benway were conducting a survey dive. The submarine was originally built to photograph the sunken fleet from the French and Indian War, and it was built to accommodate two people. In 1960, this technology was state of the art and one of the first attempts to discover all the secrets at the bottom of Lake George. Unfortunately, the baby whale was never deployed to photograph the sunken fleet. Found after 35 years underwater, this vessel was severely rusted and would never complete the mission that it was intended for. Now, I wanted to end with the baby whale because it's a more modern vessel that ties us back with the sunken fleet of 1758. Over the course of 200 years, we went from building wooden boats to transport soldiers and supplies to fitting two people in an underwater submarine to explore the depths of the lake. This fleet was the original reason that I wanted to do this talk because while the many other shipwrecks at the bottom tell a story, this fleet represents something so much bigger. Because of this collection of ships at the bottom of Lake George, this fleet is sometimes credited with being the birthplace of the modern American Navy. Now, this is controversial because many believe that the Navy didn't originate until the American Revolution in 1775. One claim comes from near Whitehall, New York. The Continental Army's construction of a fleet on Lake Champlain in 1776 makes a strong argument for being the foundation of the modern American Navy. However, people claim that this was an Army operation and not a Navy one. Philadelphia chimes in and would like to claim that their city deserves the title of being the birthplace of the Navy. On October 13th, 1775, the Continental Congress passed a resolution to acquire 2 armed vessels, and from there, the Navy grew. Now, the Navy itself actually cites this as its date of birth, but that's not all. Beverly and Marblehead, Massachusetts would like to claim this title because in 1775, American patriots outfitted warships to search for armed British transports off the New England coast. And in Machias, Maine, a group of patriots seized a Royal Navy vessel in June of 1775, and they claim that this is in fact the origin. Even Providence, Rhode Island has pointed out that they were the first ones to say, hey, we should create an American Navy. And they'd like credit for that. All of these are predated by the 260 ship fleet built and sunk in Lake George. While these dates all occur in 1775, the sunken fleet was built in 1758, nearly 20 years earlier. In addition, in the modern age, the Navy has built a stealth warship that is shaped almost exactly like the Radeau. So the ingenuity that built this warship in 1758 is being used by the Navy today. So while the origins of the American Navy are contested, I'll let you judge for yourself where you think it was truly born. I will add that this fleet at the bottom of Lake George was built by the British and not the Continental Army. So that's where I stand. We've covered a lot of different elements here tonight, but what I want you to take home is that underwater archaeology has the potential to be this huge tool that we are just beginning to utilize to answer major questions about the ancient past. There are thousands of unexplored sites that lie beneath the water surface, and some of these sites may tell us about the migration out of Africa, the peopling of North and South America, or the origins of civilization that have all been lost from rising sea levels. Today, the ships at the bottom of Lake George are protected by various national, state, and local preservation laws, and recreational divers are encouraged to act responsibly while visiting these sites. Legislation such as the Antiquities Act and the National Historic Preservation Act are the foundation for safeguarding these sites. Hopefully, these sites will preserve for many years to come, so anyone interested can continue to learn more about this history.